The dynamics of World War I were ever-changing. Even though there was a stalemate on the battlefield, different groups jumped into and out of the war throughout the 4 years that the fighting occurred. This video will discuss Italy, the Arab Revolt, and the entry of the United States into World War I. Another video, which will be linked in the description, will go over the Russian Revolution. Italy was part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria before World War I began. After war broke out, Italy wanted guarantees that they would be able to gain disputed land on their northeastern border with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria was not willing to support that proposal, and Italy did not immediately join when war broke out in 1914. Instead, they stayed on the sidelines for almost a year, waiting to hear from both sides whether they would receive an offer from either side for the things that they wanted. Finally, in April of 1915, the Allies agreed to allow the Italians to annex the land on their border with Austria in exchange for Italy joining the Allies in the fight against the Central Powers. Italy officially left the Triple Alliance and joined the Allies. The Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Germans because they believed Germany was in a stronger position to win the war, and the Ottoman Empire could regain land in Europe that was lost in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Ottoman Empire began with a campaign to take Egypt from the British. The campaign failed miserably. The Ottomans lost many troops, realizing that the British were in much stronger position and turning the war into a defensive war for the Ottomans. The British, in a stronger position, wanted to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and support the Russians with supplies in the same campaign. Under the leadership of British Secretary of the Navy Winston Churchill, a large naval force would move through the Dardanelles Strait and go directly to Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. After overwhelming the Ottomans and forcing them to surrender, the British would control the waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. Once this waterway was open, they could send supplies to the Russians and support the Eastern Front against the Germans. To gain control of the Dardanelles Strait, the British would have to send their ships through defenses that included fortresses, sea mines, and other treacherous conditions. Churchill's plan included an invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula on the west side of the strait, relieving some of the pressure of those defenses and allowing the ships to get through. While the end game of the strategy had tactical merit in the big picture of the war, the implementation was an utter disaster for the British, with 250,000 casualties and 46,000 dead. While the Ottomans had a significant amount of casualties as well, the defenses of the Ottoman Empire held, and the British were turned back. After the attack ended in that disaster, Winston Churchill was relieved of his post as the Secretary of the Navy and would take entering the army and fighting on the battlefield for the remainder of the war for him to start to rebuild his reputation after Gallipoli. The British did not want to divert more resources toward the Middle East. They needed to focus their effort on the Western Front against Germany. They were fortunate that an unlikely alliance was forged in the Middle East. The Arabs had been ruled by the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. They offered to fight for the British if the British would commit to the Arabs gaining an independent state after World War I was over. The British agreed, and the Allies gained a new fighting force in the Middle East. To maintain communications and a common goal, the British sent T.E. Lawrence to be a liaison to the Arabs and coordinate their efforts. Lawrence had studied Arab culture and lived in the Middle East as he worked at excavation sites. The Arabs coordinated with the British via Lawrence, and the two armies were able to execute a two-pronged attack against the Ottomans, with the Arabs attacking the railway lines to stop Ottoman troop and supply movements, and the British attacking targets near the Mediterranean Sea. Both armies moved north and eventually met in Damascus. The taking of the city was the end of the campaign, and the Ottomans were left with a fraction of their pre-1914 empire. The United States was committed to isolationism in 1914. The U.S. did not want to get involved in Europe's war. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 put tension between the United States and the Germans. This would start the United States on a trajectory toward war, though the U.S. would not enter until 2 years later. When the Russians dropped out of the war, the Germans gained an advantage by being able to send troops who had been fighting Russia on the Western Front to strengthen the fight against the Allies in France. While the Germans gained a tactical advantage by not having to fight a two-front war, the United States was more supportive of France and Great Britain in the outcome of the war. The Germans paused unrestricted submarine warfare after the sinking of the Lusitania, but they believed they could defeat the British quickly if they resumed the attacks, which further pushed the United States towards the Allies. Germany knew that the US would not like the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, and the final straw came with the Zimmermann telegram. The Germans believed that the United States would eventually enter the war on the side of the Allies, so they sent an encoded telegram to Mexico proposing an alliance against the United States if the US entered the war against the Germans. Germany offered to give Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to the Mexicans as an incentive to join. The message was encoded, but the British were able to intercept the message and decode it. They shared it with the United States, and when the American people learned what the Germans had done, sentiment changed from anti-war to pro-war almost overnight. Just over a month after the American people learned about the Zimmermann telegram, the U.S. Congress voted for the United States to enter the war. The U.S. entry into the war was a boost to the Allies. Britain and France were weary after years of fighting, and the Germans had gained reinforcements on the Eastern Front. The injection of a new, fresh army into the war in late 1917 deflated the German morale. The American deployment, in conjunction with the introduction of effective tanks like the Renault FT in 1918, broke the stalemate. Slowly but surely, the Allies were able to push the Germans back throughout 1819 before the Armistice was signed on November 11, 1918.